This is Metro Week. Our top story, Pima County is recovering from the recession more slowly than elsewhere in Arizona. We asked two economists to explain why. Then our Journalists Roundtable analyzes the bond issue and the week's news.
Welcome to Metro Week. I'm Andrea Kelly. Pima County is adding jobs at a slower average pace compared with elsewhere in Arizona and the nation. Why is the economy so sluggish? We'll analyze that, but first, a look at some of the numbers. Tucson is doing worse than the rest of the country on several economic indicators. One is job growth, which the University of Arizona defines as a key indicator because it affects wages and other economic growth. From 2013 to 2014, Tucson jobs grew by 0.5%. The state and national rates of job growth were nearly 2%, and the Phoenix area was nearly 2.5%. That's significant because the state lost jobs at a greater rate than the national average in the recession. Tucson also has a lower median household income than the state and national figures. The latest numbers are from 2013. They show Tucson about 9% lower than the state and nearly 15% lower than the national median. Looking ahead, this area's population is expected to grow more slowly than the state's average. The numbers are far lower than Pima County's annual average growth, which was 2.4% for 3 decades before the recession. September unemployment numbers show Arizona had no change. The total unemployment remains at 6.3%, the same as it was in August. To look at what's behind the numbers, I spoke with George Hammond, a University of Arizona economist who directs the Economic and Business Research Center at the Eller College of Management. Why is the Tucson economy recovering slower than the rest of the state?
Tucson is growing slowly, but it's important to keep in mind that we are growing. So we're adding jobs, we're adding residents, our overall income is growing. But there's no getting around the fact that it has been slow. And a big part of what's been driving that slow growth has been fiscal drag. Particularly in 2013, it was primarily federal fiscal drag, which extended even into 2014. And what that means is that due to cutbacks in federal spending, partially driven by the sequester, we saw both declines in federal government employment locally and also big drop in overall federal procurement spending, which is just federal government purchases of goods and services from the non-federal sector.
So here that might be maybe, say, contracting with a company like Raytheon.
Exactly.
Okay. And does that expand out into Cochise County, or are we talking just the Tucson metro area?
We've seen the slow growth primarily in the local economies that are really dependent on federal government spending. So that includes both Yuma and Sierra Vista Douglas.
And what about job creation? How's that looking in this area?
Job creation is positive, but it's slow. Last year, we added about 1,800 jobs for a 0.5% growth rate. It's far slower than the national growth rate and about a quarter of the state's growth rate. So we're growing, but it's really slow growth.
Now, can you also attribute that to what you called the fiscal drag, that reduced federal spending here?
Yeah, the slow growth really during the last year is primarily the federal fiscal drag. This year we'll see a little bit of state and local fiscal drag added to that with the cuts to the university and local governments.
Now, you and I were talking previously, and you mentioned that there's some impact to the fact that the U.S. dollar is gaining. So first, let's talk about what's good about that.
Well, one of the bright spots in the state's economy over the past year has actually been our export activity. Our exports rose at about triple the national rate. And what drove that was in large part exports to Mexico, which were up just over 22% last year. That's a good thing. That's been export activity is a major part of the state and local economies, both exports of goods and exports of what economists call services, which would include the Mexican visitors who are crossing the border to visit our tourist sites and to shop in the local area. So over the past year, the international sector has been a bright spot. But one thing that's really changed over the past year is that we've seen the value of the U.S. dollar rise significantly against almost all currencies, but particularly against the Mexican peso and the Canadian dollar. In fact, it's up about 27% versus the peso over the past year and about 20% versus the Canadian dollar. And that's a good thing if you're interested in booking a vacation to Mexico, or you want to buy some goods and services from Mexico or Canada, because when the dollar rises, it makes those goods and services relatively cheaper, other things the same.
The flip side.
Yeah, there's a flip side to that. As with an economist, there's always the other hand, right? And the other hand is that it makes U.S.-produced goods and services more expensive to the rest of the world, including residents in Mexico and businesses in Mexico, as well as Canada. So if the dollar stays relatively strong against those two currencies over the next year, it's going to start to be a drag on overall export activity, and it probably will affect Mexican tourist spending in the state.
Now, so we're talking about how things are doing now, post-recession. What about looking forward, looking into the future? Are we going to kind of stay at this slow growth, or are things going to pick up for Tucson?
I think we'll see growth accelerate over the next couple of years in Tucson. I think we'll see less federal fiscal drag as we look forward over the next couple of years. It won't be a major boost to the economy, but it shouldn't be as much of a drag as it has been over the past couple of years, and that will help. I think we'll also see somewhat faster population growth over the next couple of years as residential mobility really across the U.S. increases. So I think we'll see stronger income growth nationally. That will increase residential mobility. We'll also see fewer people underwater on their mortgages as house prices continue to rise. And that will help increase the mobility of people really across the U.S. And Arizona and Tucson will pick up their share of those migrants. That'll boost our population growth, which boosts our housing market, which really helps to drive growth.
And are those trends that we typically see a few years after a recession? People start to move a little more as their incomes start rising and jobs come back?
Sure, absolutely. And while I think our growth will accelerate over the next couple of years, we're not headed back to the kind of growth rates that we saw during the 30 years before the Great Recession. So I think we can do better than we have been over the past couple of years, but we're not headed back to the kind of growth we saw during the 30 years before the downturn.
So changing our expectations a little bit is going to be key to how we look at what the economy is doing.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much, George Hammond, for coming in today.
Sure. My pleasure. Thanks.
For a perspective on what's different about the rest of the state, I talked with Jim Rounds, an economist in Scottsdale. Rounds and Hammond serve on a state legislative financial advisory committee. Thanks for joining us. I want to start by asking you to expand on a comment that you made at a briefing earlier this month, and that was, you said that Tucson is a mess, at least in terms of the economy, and I'd like to ask you to explain what you meant by that economically.
Sure, and so what's difficult is that Tucson is bringing several decades worth of dysfunction in terms of politics, a little less so in terms of economic development, but the community really hasn't diversified its economic base over a longer period of time. Now, that is happening now, and I'm actually becoming optimistic about the area again, but right now the economy down there is lagging the state by quite a bit, and we're already going through a pretty tough economic expansion, so not only does the Tucson area have to backfill some of the lost jobs that happened over the last several years, but it then has to create new higher value added jobs, and that's a lot tougher than people appreciate.
Now, can you give us some context about why the rest of the state appears to be doing better and recovering faster?
Well, so it's several things. The greater Phoenix area is leading the state, and to put it in context, employment growth at about 3 to 4 is considered good. The Phoenix area is growing at about 3%. The Tucson area is growing closer to 1%, a little bit less recently, and that's a problem. Now, what the Tucson area has going for it is it has a very strong university. There's a lot of employment at the university, and historically it's had a lot of defense spending companies. So not only federal government employees, but also companies that serve the federal government. Those have been cut back some, and that's a large percentage of the Tucson's high-wage economy, where the rest of the state, and I don't want to even say the rest of the state, the Phoenix area, which is about 75% of the state's economy, is a little more diversified, but even the Phoenix area has some challenges going forward. So Tucson has some challenges that are similar to the Phoenix area and the rest of the state. They're just a little bit more extreme, but it's really the same story. But it also means that it's the same opportunities. It's just going to be a little bit more difficult to achieve those.
So you touched on the term that George Hammond used as fiscal drag, that government spending in the Tucson area. So it sounds like you're saying because some of the other economies, or at least the Phoenix area economy, is more diversified in terms of sources of income, that fiscal drag is not as much of an issue, but it could be an issue in areas like Yuma, for example.
That's right. In fact, a lot of the areas in southern Arizona are going to struggle over the next decade or so because here's how the economics works, and it's pretty simple. If you create a high-wage job, say it's at an aerospace company that is supported by a federal government contract, that also creates multiplier effects, which means you're creating another 2 or 3 jobs in the economy. So then you reverse that. If that job is cut, you lose an additional 2 or 3 jobs in the economy. And so when you factor in the pure, just direct job losses that have been realized because of federal government cutbacks, as well as a very difficult downturn that we went through in Arizona and the weak recovery, there's a lot to overcome. So it's not just that lost job at a Raytheon or a lost job at some other place. You're adding these up, so it's really 3 or 4 lost jobs when you're talking about each individual high-wage job. So once you factor in kind of that wonky economic math, it becomes a much bigger deal than people realize.
Can you talk about why the Tucson economy is less diversified, or maybe flip that and talk about why some other parts of the state have a more diversified economy? Are those due to deliberate decisions that were made by leaders?
Yes, and so this goes back decades. In fact, the Tucson area at one point was projected to be essentially what the greater Phoenix area turned into, about 3/4 of the state. But there was a little bit more protection about growth, and politics was a little bit more dysfunctional. Now, I don't want to say that it's functional in the Phoenix area either. I think politics is dysfunctional across the country. It's just been a little bit more challenging. And so the Phoenix area in the 70s and the 80s and even into the 90s a little bit, they were a little bit more proactive with economic expansion, bringing in some of the high-wage industrial jobs. But even the Phoenix area took a step back, and they got away from being aggressive with trying to develop the economy. Now, the Tucson area was almost the opposite of that, where they were very weak in terms of trying to promote the high-wage jobs in the economy, or at least being aggressive about it. And now they're finally getting everything together. And so going through the downturn, I think, was a little bit of a wake-up call. And so now I'm seeing with the county government, I'm seeing with the city government, not just the politicians, but the staff as well. They're working very hard on economic development, and this is different than what I saw 10 years ago. And so I'm perfectly comfortable being tough on Tucson decision-making over the decades, but this is the first time since I've been an economist, so the last 20 years or so, where I felt good that at least over the next several years, there's going to be some opportunities.
Now, both regions are trying to attract spending from Mexico. Are they forced now then to be competing against each other for that spending, or is there enough money to go around?
Oh, there's enough money to go around. I think it'll be complementary. I think this is one of those cases where hard work in one area combined with hard work from another will it's a rising tide lifting all ships situation. Now, the Pima County and Tucson area is going to have additional opportunities because of the even better proximity to Mexico, but Arizona did a really bad job over the last decade especially, and you know all the political controversies that have been going on in Arizona. Everybody across the nation knows, but there's been a lot of outreach recently. So we haven't been taking advantage of the international trade opportunities that we could have been. And I'm seeing that in some of the planning documents coming out of the county, and there's already discussion about this in some of the activities going on with the city. And so I think it's not just talking about Phoenix and Tucson being on the same page. It's the city and the county in the Tucson area being on the same page, them working together with the greater Phoenix area, and then working together with the Mexico contingent. There's a lot of people that are involved in economic development and a lot of politicians, public policy people that have been traveling to Mexico, mending a lot of these relations. And I think that Tucson has an opportunity to expand this in terms of percentage, maybe even greater than in the Phoenix area. In fact, I'm really optimistic about Pima County going forward again, Tucson, and even Pinal County. I think that the Tucson area is going to have to be cooperating on economic development with Pinal County quite a bit too.
Economist Jim Rounds, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lorraine Rivera. Tonight on Arizona Week, Mars exploration at the U of A makes its way to Hollywood.
I was just thrilled to see that our Pathfinder camera is one of the stars of the show, because this becomes the communication path from Mars to the Earth.
Now our journalist roundtable. Joining me in the studio are Astrid Galvan of the Associated Press, David Rupp-Calvis of Tucson Local Media, and Zach Ziegler, my colleague here at Arizona Public Media. Thanks to all of you for coming in. David, I want to start by seeing what sort of a sense you are getting of the businesses that Inside Tucson Business covers of the local economic recovery.
You know, like your experts, most of them are saying things are slow but steadily improving. You know, in our latest issue, we actually have a special pull-out. Beach Fleischman did a survey of hundreds of CFOs around the state, and they compiled all their information together and released it in Inside Tucson Business. And in Tucson, it's interesting because most of the CFOs right now are saying things really aren't great, but they're fairly optimistic moving forward. You know, if you ask them today, 25% say things are better today than they were a year ago, 41% say they're exactly the same, and 34% say they're worse. But moving forward, 91% combined are pretty optimistic that things will improve in the next year. So, I mean, most of the businesses are fairly optimistic, but most of them say that things are not going very quickly and fairly slow.
I guess to some degree, something is better than nothing.
That's certainly true.
Do any of the businesses you cover have this sense that Phoenix or the Phoenix region is doing a lot better than Tucson? Are they aware of that?
Oh, they're very much aware, and there's no doubt about it. You know, the Phoenix CFOs, 84% of them say things are better today than it was a year ago. I mean, they're certainly more optimistic and they're looking better. But I think Tucson will slowly catch up. You know, they talked about the economic lag from primarily, you know, government spending, state and federal. And I don't think the state's going to improve. I think we are going to probably get things better when it comes to, you know, Davis-Monthan and federal spending in the Tucson area.
So what are our local leaders doing to try to better the economy and better situation for businesses?
There's a couple of things, actually. You know, the county just came out with a study that showed the Sonoran Corridor. And, you know, I don't know if you guys have talked about that, but there's work going on around Raytheon to improve some roads, and they're trying to build basically a new interstate almost to join things together. But if that is built, and it would require passage of the bond issue, they're saying it could have a $32 billion economic impact. And the goal would be to bring in more companies similar to Raytheon, you know, defense contractors, biotechnical, biomedical, big money, high paying jobs that would, you know, go into that area. And it actually would be a great spot for it. Just obviously putting out a study and seeing it happen in reality can be different things.
There's always kind of that hope and talk of establishing downtown Tucson as kind of a new tech entrepreneurial area. That is always something that's very pushed for and looked at, and kind of trying to get angel investment and early stage startup type companies coming in, and basically just keeping people from the U of A staying here as they graduate and moving in and establishing their businesses here.
Zach, what else can you tell us about the amount of federal money that comes here and the impact it has on the local economy?
Well, it's much more than the obvious ones like Davis-Monthan or say Raytheon and the rest of the aeronautics industry, where these are all directly supplying goods. You also have to think about things like part of the U of A's grant money coming from the National Institute of Health, the National Science Foundation. There's federal dollars there, although working its way through another entity. Tourism. Look at our open lands, Saguaro National Park, Coronado National Forest. When it comes to nature tourism, that's also federal dollars. And the healthcare industry here, that is a very strong, very well-paying industry. Well, you also have to look at Medicare and Medicaid dollars then coming in to help fund that industry. So yes, there is really a lot of federal money coming in here, but that can be said of a lot of places in some of those areas, like Medicare dollars. It's kind of a common thing everywhere that a lot of people don't think about when it comes to federal money.
Although our aging population might help inflate that number here compared to other metro areas.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, Tucson is really seeing a growing influx of retirees, baby boomers moving to the area. It is a place where there is an above average percentage of the population in that age demographic. So yeah, there are a lot of the top industries in Tucson that are somehow touched by federal dollars.
And then, of course, the big one, David, is Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. And actually, Inside Tucson Business is covering the economic impact of that base this week. So what's the bottom line of that impact? What did you find?
Davis-Monthan is probably the #1 economic engine for Tucson. You know, in 2014, a year that there was still some of that government lag, there was almost $1 billion in direct spending because of Davis-Monthan, another $500 million from retirees from Davis-Monthan. That's $1.5 billion in a bad year. I mean, so things will certainly improve, but that's just the beginning of it. I mean, there's businesses, you know, we talk about Raytheon, but what we don't really think about a lot is, you know, the restaurant right outside the main gate that relies 100% on airmen coming off base to eat. You know, there's a lot of retailers there that are selling their goods to airmen. There are businesses that are building things, cleaning things, supplying materials to Davis-Monthan. I mean, the economic impact is probably something we can never put a direct number on, but it's certainly massive and probably the #1 thing in Tucson.
I'm going to switch to unemployment, still an economic figure, Zach, but the numbers came out just yesterday showing that Arizona's overall unemployment rate is flat. What does that tell us? What can we learn from that?
Well, it's better than the previous couple of reports where it was going up. Arizona recently went through a really big drop in the unemployment numbers. Now it's almost like it might be kind of a correction. Things are pulling up, now they're leveling out. It does traditionally happen. Summer tends to be the slow season in Arizona for jobs. You don't have as many tourists coming to the area. You don't have the jobs from education. That was one thing that's noted in the report, is that the state added 30,000 jobs in education. Now, because that's a seasonal thing, those numbers are seasonally adjusted out. But it kind of shows that, yeah, it's been a slow recovery for the state, particularly for Arizona, or for Tucson, where the numbers are slightly better than the state's average, but it's also kind of hard to say because Tucson, there's a smaller sample size, so you start getting into statistical anomalies there. Tucson's number is a little harder to report because of that.
You know, one thing I've noticed, and you don't hear about this a lot, is there are jobs available. You know, there are firms out there advertising, there are job fairs fairly regularly. I know all the call centers are hiring, and some of them pay really well. You know, you can get $14 or $15 an hour there. You know, it's not a Raytheon job where you're gonna, you know, make a boatload of money and retire off of it, but there are jobs available. You know, I hear from a lot of people at my office where they say, I can't find work, can't find a job. There are jobs. There may not be dream jobs, but I think those are coming. You know, I mean, the U of A going up to Oro Valley, Innovation Park up there, the move toward biosciences and biomedical, I think, is going to provide good jobs. So I think there's some good things coming. It's just not a short-term, quick answer.
And then you also run into the labor force market match being kind of an issue. The running joke I always tell is anytime I go out and do a story about healthcare or hospitals, my wife's a physical therapist, I come away with a job offer for her every time. And that kind of shows where, you know, maybe some of our holes are in places that do require a little more education, and we don't necessarily have a workforce that's trained to do the jobs that are open here.
And we do hear that a lot from local leaders, that there is potentially a mismatch between the readiness of the workforce to do the jobs that are here or the jobs that the area wants to attract. And another indicator of how the economy is doing, Zach, is the housing data, the housing statistics. We also got those numbers this week from the Tucson Association of Realtors. What are the trends?
Things are looking positive. The phrase that's been going on for quite a while now from the Association of Realtors is slow, steady growth. This month, the number of sales, average and median sales price, sales volume, which is the total amount of money going into the market in exchange for property, all of those are up year over year. There was a little bit of a concern a couple months ago about inventory. That number is now slowly starting to pick up and get back to where it should be. So housing-wise, things are looking pretty good.
All right, and Astrid, I want to switch to what is a different topic, except it relates to our federal spending here, and that's the Border Patrol. Not not to let that go unsaid. That's a big federal portion of the spending here.
Absolutely.
We got some new information about the Border Patrol's use of force against suspects or during arrests, during operations. What did we find out this week?
This week we found out that there was a reduction in use of force over the last fiscal year. So there was actually a 26% drop, which is fairly significant. One thing to note is that the use of lethal force actually didn't change very much. It was mostly use of force less than lethal. So we're talking about beanbags, batons. And the Border Patrol attributes this decrease to more transparency, better training, better protocols. But the Border Patrol Union has been fairly critical and says, basically there's too much pressure on agents and they're just second guessing themselves.
That's interesting. The ACLU this week also released a report on civil rights violations, which to me seems to go hand in hand with these claims. And what's that one about?
That was a pretty scathing report. They collected over 100 complaints that were filed against CBP. Things like, border agents being extremely rude, not answering questions, arresting people without telling them what they're arresting them for, or detaining them. Another pretty interesting component of that report was that they found that arrests made at checkpoints, which anybody who lives in southern Arizona drives through them at one point or another, are fairly low, actually less than 1% of the overall arrests that Border Patrol makes of immigrants take place at checkpoints. And that's important because there's been kind of an increasing opposition to checkpoints. There's lawsuits about it, there's been protests, and so this was kind of the first insight that we got into what's actually happening there.
Yeah, we seem to sort of have more attention on those checkpoints than sort of the rest of Border Patrol operations, those of us who live in this area, whereas then this report is saying that there are less incidents there, negative incidents.
Right.
And then also along the border, this week the Associated Press had a story about this project that is painting the border fence. Tell us what that's about.
Yes, so there's an artist, she's California-based, she's Mexico-born, but she was raised actually in San Diego on the border with Mexico, and so she, this is the second time she's done it, she painted the fence sky blue, basically, so that it can blend in with the sky. And the purpose of that is, it's kind of a political statement. She's saying, this fence has caused so much pain, people have died trying to cross it, and they got a lot of attention. She got a lot of volunteers that helped her paint the fence blue from the Nogales, Sonora side.
So looking north to the U.S., it looks similar to the color of the sky, so it's less intrusive.
Right.
Now, are they also painting the north side looking south into Mexico?
They didn't now, and I don't know if there's any plans to do so.
Now, the Associated Press ran some photos from the San Diego area that actually not just painted it a solid color, but made it actually look like the beach.
Right.
The portion of the fence that goes out into the ocean. So what's the goal of the project? Are they trying to paint all of the metro areas along the border, or what's the scope?
I don't think that it's going to be that wide. I know that she has a residency, the artist, her name's Ana Teresa Fernandez, she has a residency at ASU, and so I don't know if there's plans to do more border fences, but I know that she's definitely trying to raise awareness and trying to get attention to really the cause of the migrant.
And the intrusiveness of the border on the social systems, it sounds like?
Right.
Okay. And Zach, I want to talk about it's another economic story, but it's been ongoing for a while, and that's the Sahuarita Town Council approved a big project this week. So tell us what that project is.
Yes, slowly over the next 40 to 50 years, the area of the Farmers Investment Company, a large pecan farmer in the area, about 7,000 acres, they basically plan to start phasing out some of their pecan operations, and this was a plan to help use that land to smartly grow the Sahuarita area. There's talk of business area, industrial space, open and park space, 3,000 acres of housing, a second high school, plenty of things that would really help them as they grow. Granted, this is years and years down the line, but having this plan ready basically ensures that smart, well-planned growth goes forward as opposed to just kind of willy-nilly going up and putting up what is needed at that given moment.
So in our last 30 seconds, I want to point out that governments always have to approve development plans in any area, but is there any government obligation to the development here? Is the government planning to use any of that space?
They will be developing the park space and some of the open space as necessary, but they do not have to pay for it. FICO is actually donating that land to the town.
All right. Well, thank you, all three of you, for coming in today. We talked about a broad array of topics. They all kind of fit together, though. That's it for this week. As always, you can find more content from the Arizona Public Media Newsroom on our website. Thanks for watching.